Right. Good afternoon, and welcome to another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. As of late, AMET has been very, very busy. As you all know, we meet with members of Congress or their staffers on an almost daily basis, and they've come to rely upon us for our accurate analyses and our current information. We get to have wonderful webinars each week with terrific experts that I've grown to adore and respect, such as Behnam Taleblu of FDD. And we write and publish at least one article each week. Please look out for my article that's due to appear on this week's Newsweek, A Sheep in Wolf's Clothing, about our topic of today, the newly elected president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian. As we all know, the people of Iran went to the polls last Friday and selected as their president Masoud Pezeshkian, a 69-year-old, former cardiologist, and he came in with a 53.6% majority against the ultra-conservative opponent Saeed Jalili. There's been a tremendous amount of media enthusiasm for Mr. Pezeshkian. Typical among the enthusiasts was the New York Times stating after his election, quote, Iran may see a softening of its absolutist foreign policy and even an opportunity for a new diplomatic opening. Not to be outdone, the Washington Post declared Iran reformist wins presidency, seeks engagement with the West. Reuters led with the headline, Iranian voters picked moderate as president to replace hardline Raisi. As we all know, in order to even run, the Iranian Guardian Council, a non-elected body of 12, in which Ayatollah Khamenei chooses 6 members, a candidate has to be approved. And on Monday, as reported in JCPOA, Mr. Pezeshkian reaffirmed his commitment to destroy the state of Israel, saying that Iran's many terror proxies across the region, quote, will not allow Israel's criminal policies to continue. He wrote to Chief Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah that, quote, I am certain that the resistant movements in the region will not allow this regime to continue its warmongering and criminal policies against the oppressed people of Palestine and other nations of the region. Is Mr. Pezeshkian actually a reformer? There is nobody that I think is more preeminently qualified to talk about the Islamic Republic of Iran and Mr. Pezeshkian's background than Behnam Taleblu, who is a senior fellow at the wonderful Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Behnam previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. I'm going to dispense with his very, very long and brilliant background and just say that he's constantly quoted in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Fox News, the Associated Press, Agence France Presse, among others. And he has written for The Hill, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Fox News, The National Interest, U.S. News, and World Report. So, and he is often on BBC News, Fox News, CBS Interactive, C-SPAN, Defense News. Behnam earned his MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago and his BA in International Affairs from the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. So without further ado, Behnam, we're really honored to have you once again. And can you explain to us who exactly is Mr. Pezeshkian?
Well, Sarah, thank you again for the opportunity to be with you and Amit and all the virtual listeners and viewers tuning in today. they're tuning in at a very important time, both with what's going on in the States as well as what's going on in the region. We had some breaking news, you could say, the other day, where the Director of National Intelligence had connected the dots, if you will, between the Islamic Republic of Iran and, if you will forgive me, some useful idiots here in the States who were amplifying not just the messages that the regime was keen to message and move further into the American body politique, but I think for the first time ever talked about material support to pro-Gaza protesters here in the States. There were a lot more questions than answers. But the reason I'm beginning a conversation that you had mentioned about an election, or shall we say, or more aptly agree upon, a selection of who is going to serve as Iran's 14th president of the Islamic Republic come this August when they have their inauguration ceremony, is because there is more continuity than change. And I think in the West, in particular in America, and with immense respect to some of those outlets you mentioned, in particular among the staff and the editorial boards of some of those outlets, there is a understandable confusion and conflation and projection. And if I feel tired or look tired or feel downtrodden and dispossessed by this debate, it's because I am, and I have lived it and have the scars to tell the tale from when many of these outlets, again, missed the story of continuity and sold us a story of change, when similarly back in 2013, there was another candidate at that time styled more from abroad than at home, a moderate candidate that continued, if not amplified and intensified, many of the things that have made and sustained the Islamic Republic of Iran a pariah. And what folks back then, like former President Hassan Rouhani, and folks now, like incumbent, soon-to-be President Masoud Pezeshkian, do for the Islamic Republic is they essentially put lipstick on a pig, stylistically. And if there is anything substantive that will flow from that, it is their ability to engage much more deeply, but still transactionally, with Western interlocutors and counterparts, and be able to achieve the same stated ends that the Islamic Republic has to help the regime stay on course for what they say and what they do. And they're not shy about that. That's death to America. That's death to Israel. You see the real world costs of that in the region, as well as the story that we led with today. But by simply offering different ways and means to achieve those ends. And I think it's really high time we remove the stigma from some policy options, that any kind of dialogue is productive dialogue, any kind of dialogue is good dialogue. And this individual Pezeshkian, in my view, was promoted, brought to the helm, if you will, by the only voter of consequence in the Islamic Republic, which is the supreme leader, and that's a title meant to be taken rather literally. And then my qualm with the other flank, you could say the right in America, is that we have looked too statically at that story of stasis, of how Khamenei, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Supreme National Security Council has been able to keep things moving in a certain direction, that we've missed this individual's ability to balance and bandwagon and, like a chef in a very large kitchen, move different pots and pans around. And you saw, indeed, Iran went from having a reformist president in the 90s and early 2000s to a polyester-clad Holocaust denier, then to a self-styled or Western-styled but moderate cleric, quote-unquote, then to another cleric that was the polar opposite, and then now to a heart surgeon-styled reformer. And the ability to bring these different factions onto the playing field, to stylistically allow those editorial boards and pages to project onto Iran that which they wish versus that which actually exists. And that is why, if you look at me, or you sense some monotony, or you sense a little bit of frustration in my voice and in my appearance, is because we've seen this before, we've been through this before, and we ought not to continue to make the same mistake. Everyone who participated in the candidate in the electoral contest, if you will, it was 80 individuals who essentially auditioned to run for president after snap elections were announced because there was a helicopter crash that killed Iran's former president, Ebrahim Raisi, just this May. There were about 80 individuals. Of those 80, the Guardian Council, that entity you mentioned, which is loyal to the supreme leader of Iran, essentially whittled that down to 6. Had any of the 6 ideologically, had any of the 6 politically been put forward, or elevated to the position of president, ideologically, they would have had, they would have been considered kosher, or more aptly, they would have been considered halal in this instance. But this is about style as well as substance. Here in the States, we have a real understanding in the past decade in our own politics as how style can have a substance of its own. And Iran here, without changing much of the substance, is able to offer you a fundamentally different style. And I don't think Pezeshkian is here to transform the relationship with America and Iran, certainly not the relationship with Israel and Iran. I think these are really more agents of stasis than change. But here is where I am worried, and I'm sorry I went on so long for more of an introduction. But this person was brought to the helm because he will serve a purpose. He will serve a purpose at home, which is to fracture the dissident and opposition, and even abroad, the diaspora communities, which have been more intertwined in being for regime change than for reform than ever before. The population has been boycotting electoral contests en masse. The regime has talked about essentially a 49.6% participation rate, when the previous round, the one in late June, was in the high 30s. There's no way that number grew in less than a week or 10 days at this speed. The regime talks about elections because it bolsters their legitimacy, it bolsters their security, and it bolsters their deterrence. This is an unholy trinity of why everyone from military officials to religious officials to political officials in Iran routinely fib and want to be seen as having a groundswell of massive popular support because they believe it will immunize them. You don't have to take it from me. You don't have to take it from Behnam, who's working for FDD, living and working and breathing in Washington. The commander of the aerospace force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps just a few months back said that the presence of people on the street, going to the ballot box, at the ballot box, is essentially filling the magazines of the arms of the armed forces. This is how they see their own people instrumentally. So this is one reason why Pezeshkian was brought at home, and to particularly help them survive the post-women life freedom movement when they know they have lost vast swaths of Iranian society, and they're hoping that a stylistic change will introduce shocks and transaction costs into a more unified, into a more cohesive opposition. And at home, if it's a Trump, and abroad, if it's a Trump 2.0, then this person could potentially be a shield against transatlantic coordination. And if it's a Biden 2.0, then this could be a temptation for the potential of an off-ramp into nuclear diplomacy that may not go anywhere, but that would certainly provide the regime with sanctions relief. So that is really the 50,000-foot, I think, assessment I wanted to put forward for the viewers to know. But before we get into this guy's background and what he did as health minister and his role in parliament and all this stuff, just so we're clear on these labels and on what the regime is trying to do here, because this is not a normal election where a population that believes in their system went to the polls. This is an engineered process to achieve an outcome through style.
Right, right. So you spoke about the economic change. How much of this election do you think is in order to relieve the sanctions regime against Iran and, as you said, an off-ramp for them to be part of the international community's economic development corporation?
Well, even when we talk about joining the international community, even under the ultra hardline Raisi government, Iran was winning more friends abroad. Iran had achieved détente, for lack of a better word, with its rival, ideational, ethnic, and sectarian rival of Saudi Arabia. Was moved further into the BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Iran benefited immensely from basically the wave of anti-Semitism that followed the Israel-Gaza war, that followed the October 7 terrorist attacks, where the pariah state got to paint others as a pariah just because of changing political winds. So the Islamic Republic has no problem, if you will, being seen as being part of the international community. What they don't want to do is to pay the cost of being a normal nation, because they simply know, in terms of regime, in terms of state, in terms of their raison d'etre, they have a fundamentally different interest and orientation. So we have to be, with respect, a little bit careful, because this regime will totally be willing to do oil deals, business deals, but that should never be seen as a sign of moderation, change, or the word du jour, genuine reform. In fact, this is essentially what the technocrats who were at the helm in the 1990s under the Rafsanjani government, competent, understandable, trying to improve the economy after the Iran-Iraq war, but still doing things like, we're coming up to the 30th anniversary now of the terrorist attack in Buenos Aires in Argentina at EMEA. So this is essentially the track I think that this individual is going on. So yes, he has a mandate to improve the economy, but also he has a more important mandate from the supreme leader to hold back things rather than to give things. So yes, he's looking for sanctions relief, but he's also looking to introduce transaction costs and shocks into a growing transatlantic alliance. Let's not forget, while the Biden administration may have been shaky on Iran, the European Union has toughened their stance. They were to the right of America at the IEA Board of Governors. And just recently, the Canadians, our lovely neighbor to the north, designated the IRGC in its entirety as a terrorist organization. These are not small things. And these are the things the Islamic Republic may want to impede with a stylistic change at the top with someone like Pezeshkian.
We did see some videos of some people who, certainly did not represent the Shiite clerics celebrating on the street that the Islamic Republic put forth. How much of this do you think is simply a smokescreen? How much of it is real? Do you think the people within the Islamic Republic are really believing some of the propaganda that the Republic puts forward, that he is a true moderate and a true reformer? Will he change the hijab laws? Will there be freedom of dissent? Will there be freedom of the press?
There's these real kind of academic debates that we have here in Washington and also among the Iran watcher community around the world, which is to say that anytime someone who is a part of or who is supported by Iran's ailing reformist faction, the people that style themselves in Persian as Eslah Talab, reformist seeking, if you will, presidents come to the helm, we have a debate over, do these individuals personally have the intent to meaningfully change? And then regardless of that personal intent, is there a structural capability, a meaningful way within Iran's Byzantine political system to act on said personal intent and push for reform? And as important as an academic debate this is, the net result of wherever you come down on it is that the individual cannot and has not been able to and could not. And so it's important to respect this debate, but to be able to push away from the table on this debate. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you look at regime-provided statistics from before there was a runoff, when Pezeshkian was not one of 2 candidates, but when he was one of 6 candidates, just from about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, the only 2 provinces out of Iran's 30 provinces that had an increase from the 2021 election, which brought Raisi to the helm, was Tehran, which is the base of the reformists. It's the political headquarters of the reformists, and Qom, which is basically one of the major Shiite seminary cities. That's it. Every other province in Iran had a downturn in the first round of electoral turnout in the Iranian calendar year 1403 versus the Iranian calendar year 1400. So this is just an important piece to say here, that there is a reformist faction in Iran. Their definition of reform is not our definition of reform, but more importantly, that reformist faction is highly quarantined. And in fact, there are people with some means, access to political and economic elites, likely but not exclusively part of the upper middle class to upper class of that society, and people who give legitimacy to this system because they believe perhaps not in everything about the system, but they believe that capital is coward and therefore, find a more competent manager, and the luxurious lifestyle that you see in the Instagram of the rich kids of Tehran, or the things that people are eating now in that country, which, send shockwaves down the spine of people who watch the foodie accounts of what people are able eating in Dubai with gold leaf wrapped steaks and all this kind of stuff. This stuff is existing not just in places where there is excess capital, like across the Persian Gulf, but also in Iran itself, which is subject to all these sanctions, which just gives you a little bit of insight as to the kind of not even crony capitalism, but the hyper Islamist, authoritarian black market crony capitalism that exists in that country. So there's no doubt that those individuals who do look with immense respect, I will probably, you do look cooler than I am. I'm sure you do have cooler genes than I, but my line du jour has always been with people who have genes cooler than I. With people who have genes cooler than you and I. You look at it, it's just because someone may have a fashionable disposition doesn't mean that they necessarily have, good politics. So this is the people who would be inclined to support the reformist faction and still believe in that political project. But the vast majority of Iranians who you would not see because you see empty polling stations, you would not see because they have been making memes and jokes about this election. The phrase that you've seen both inside and outside Iran in Persian is sirke intikhabat, which is the circus of the elections, mocking exactly that people are even calling this thing elections. Those people, it doesn't matter how they look, it doesn't matter how they dress, because they come from different geographies, different demographies, different social classes, different age groups, but particularly at the helm of this protest movement is Generation Z. And they have been saying since 2017, 2018, Eslah Talab Usulgara Dige Tamum Mashara, which translates to reformists, principalists, the game is over. So the vast majority of the population that did boycott, that didn't think they had a dog in the fight, or that didn't think they wanted to safeguard their Maserati in Tehran, or their mansion in North Tehran, or whatever else, or they weren't some ideological besieged family member or something like that. This vast majority is done with the fiction that there is even two sides to a political spectrum in Iran.
What is it about the West that is so willing always to believe the Iranian propaganda and to project our own values, to believe the words moderate and reformer?
Let me take with respect a page from General McMaster here, who coined this really great term, strategic narcissism. And you have tons of stand-up comedians talking about this as well, in different degrees, because what people are seeing in all walks of their life. The general talked about this in terms of foreign policy and strategy in Washington, how everyone puts Washington at the center of it, when in reality, the adversary has a view, the adversary has agency. Comedians are talking about it when people inject America into all sorts of debates and conversations, whether that's as places as far away from South America or even South Asia. There are organic things happening in these parts of the world that are totally isolated or separated from us. So we shouldn't impose ourselves. And the irony is the academy, on the one hand, in the States, is always talking about ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism, and on the other hand, is always acting in that fashion because it keeps imposing itself. It keeps imposing Washington, it keeps imposing America, it keeps imposing the West onto a series of debates. And so, in my view, the most honest answer to your question is it's a cultural issue here in the West, and particularly in America, to buy hook, line, and sinker what they're saying, especially if what they're saying, hook, line, and sinker, has some kind of counter narrative, counter American zeitgeist, counter mainstream flavor to it that's particularly appealing to us for some reason. And then ultimately the theory of the case, if it's ever brought forward, that things are as they are, particularly if things are as bad as they are, because the causal chain points to something America did, rather than something that may have happened on the ground. So you put all of this together, the strategic narcissism, the cultural element, we are, in this sense, culturally illiterate as scholars and experts and analysts if we use these terms that they give us, if we fall for the debates that they give us. And what we need really is, in terms of the next generation of scholarship on Iran, we need cultural literacy to be able to push past this stuff. And I hope that a little bit today, I have been able to shine a light on that.
Right, right. And we've seen over the last several months that many nations, even those who have signed the Abraham Accords with the United States, have been running to Tehran. Why do you think that is?
I am incredibly worried about this, and that's not at all because I think the rulers of the GCC countries or MBS in particular in Saudi Arabia, for example, it's not at all, I think, because they harbor a different emotional view of Tehran or they see the Islamic Republic as not a malign force, because I'm actually quite sure that they still do. They are in a smaller universe given their geography. And unfortunately, what the Islamic Republic has been able to cement for them, given the bipartisan track record of foreign policy failure in Washington towards the GCC states over the past decade and a half, in terms of countering and containing and rolling back the diverse threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm talking nuclear, missile, military, proxy, terrorism, illicit finance, you name it. We have had some shortcomings. And because those countries quite literally live on the front lines, and culturally and dispositionally, they can go between balancing and bandwagoning to continue to create the space for their political and statehood's existence. And they live in a changing world too. So that balancing and bandwagoning regional element is now being transposed into a more globalized and multipolar world than ever before. That you're seeing things like the Tehran Riyadh normalization happened before the Tehran Jerusalem normalization. You're seeing things like a wanted war criminal like Putin being welcomed with such open arms in the UAE, with such pomp and circumstance. You're seeing things like Bahrain, which, is its territorial integrity and sovereignty has routinely been under threat from the government of the Islamic Republic. And even them too are being forced to hedge. And as much as I disagree with, and I think we should be constraining and stopping this unproductive, and that's putting it politely, behavior from our friends and key partners in the region, I understand why they're doing it. And they're doing it because for a decade and a half now, they have seen different administrations not necessarily have their back. The JPOA being negotiated in secret, then the JCPOA, all the hostage diplomacy with Oman, all of the back channels. Then, of course, the Yemen war. Then you layer on the politics of the Yemen war. Then you talk about the fact that there was the Khashoggi crisis for Riyadh in the US. Then you layer on the fact that you've had three very different presidents, Obama, Trump, Biden, talk very differently about so many issues. But when they talk about the region, always talk about leaving the region and pivot to Asia and great power competition and foreign policy with middle class, and almost mocking these major partners despite their political and military integration into a US supported order in that region. And the Iranians on the cheap have seen this, been able to put a shiv in their side with the Houthis, put a shiv in their side with the Aramco attack and the drone attack and the missile attacks and all of this kind of stuff. And then once they go in with a knife, then they follow up with the handshake. And what the Islamic Republic is trying to do is to not erase these Arab states, not to overnight turn them into mini Islamic republics, but on balance, to create more problems that arise from the Israel GCC partnership, the America GCC partnership, by forcing those states to hedge and to pay for their security, such that today Riyadh may not want to actively join all of the Red Sea piracy stuff that's going on and anti-shipping stuff that's going on, because since November, when the Houthis entered the fight, they have not, ironically, shot once at Saudi Arabia. So Iran is trying to box them in this way. And that's why I understand the moves they're making, but these are very dangerous precedents to set.
Right. So you mentioned that the European Union has moved to the right of, bless you, of the United States. But in the recent elections of the French and British parliaments have moved to the left. How do you think that will impact on the region and on their relationship with Israel?
Well, At least for the EU, with the French election, I haven't followed that closely, but with the EU, it's really much more about the Franco-German partnership there, economically and politically. And one hopes that still, whatever way the French Parliament may have slided, that sentiments other than mercantilism out of Germany could help move the French towards the center. It's a mixed bag when you talk about new labor in the UK, for example. There are helpful things and helpful signs to see about many Labour Party. I'm not just talking about backbenchers here, but Labour Party shadow government folks, parliamentarians that had been talking about seeing the region not through rosy-colored glasses, and we're talking about supporting things like the prescription of the IRGC as a terrorist organization in the UK. So now this new Labour government, the Keir Starmer government, really does have an opportunity to put their money where their mouth is and represent a break from some of that more dangerous stuff on the Israel partnership, on the America partnership that you saw coming out of the likes of the mouths of Jeremy Corbyn and his friends and affiliates. So it's very much potential cause for concern, potential room for optimism, depending on, it's like a kaleidoscope. On whatever issue you spin it, you might get a slightly different answer. I mean, you will get a drastically different answer with a slightly different constellation of players in there. So I think it's very much a to be continued and requires our attention.
Right. I was just thinking of one further question in terms of, well, we know that, yes, Mr. Pezeshkian is from a Kurdish region. How much of the Kurdish votes supported him? I'm not sure if he is actually Kurdish, but and he has some affiliations with minority groups. He does speak Arabic. He does speak Kurdish. Did he get any Kurdish support?
I haven't actually done a post run. I've looked at the first round. I haven't done a post runoff assessment yet. But also, when you mentioned his background, he's actually double. He's Azeri and Kurdish. So you're right. He does also speak Arabic. He allegedly, I think, speaks English and French as well, or to some degree speaks English and French. But here, in terms of other minority languages, yes, he speaks Arabic, he speaks Kurdish, and he speaks Azeri. He's an Azeri. He's got Azeri Kurdish stock, patrilineally and matrilineally. So that could be a potentially interesting thing to look at. But when you back away from it, not really, because Iran's supreme leader is also half Azeri. For the past 900 years of 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran, you've had some level of Turkic political rule with still a Persian bureaucracy. So yeah, this is also a bit kaleidoscopic. I've seen a few outlets talk about him being able to garner more of this vote. The two areas I would recommend folks take a look at if one does want to play the game of believing regime statistics, which is always dubious, is the two minority province areas that were highly active during the 2022-2023 Women Life Freedom Uprising. And that was Kurdistan in the west, and that was Sistan and Baluchistan in the southeast.
Interesting. So to be continued. So we also one of our viewers just wrote in, can we make regime change a strategy?
Well, it could be, as in we all share similar ends, and I think the vast majority of people here want a more representative government, but they also, they have security concerns as well. They also want a non-nuclear Iran, for example. That could be the end. That could be, again, a price floor to build a better Iran policy. You could have the ends of, stable, representative Iran that is non-nuclear. The means, the ways can be regime change as a strategy, and the inputs in that could be maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the Iranian people. We have to tie in the thing that the regime fears the most, which is not Israeli military pushback or US cyber or US military. The thing the regime fears the most, and they've shown it and they've said it, is their own population. And we have to tie that element in. And we have the luxury here in Washington, and I, as an Iranian American, I have to, we have the luxury of being able to make the argument about that which is in the U.S. national interest is also that which is in our ideational interest, and that which actually correlates and overlaps with that which could be good for the Iranian people. Because Washington seldom gets to have this alignment between strategy and values in the region.
Yeah, so how much of this do you believe was to placate the restive domestic Iranian population, and how much of it was for international consumption, or both?
I think it's precisely a 50-50, but not to placate, but to shatter both, to shatter two consensuses that were forming, to shatter the fact that people inside Iran who were of different age groups, of different ethnic and social backgrounds and classes, were able to converge on one truth over the past, between half decade to decade, which is that it's not their jobs or their local governance or something unique to their specific life. Like hypothetically, if they're a bus driver, it's not the bus union that is a problem. It's the government in Tehran that is the problem. There has been that major coalescence, and there is a desire to shatter that. And that's why the harsh response to November 2019, the 1,500 killed. That's why the harsh response to not just Women Life Freedom, but to the protest that came several months before the Women Life Freedom, the 6+ day nationwide protests in Iran that were touched off by a combination of poor economic governance, Ukraine war-induced supply chain shortages, post-pandemic induced shocks that all impacted wheat trade across the Middle East that were coming from Eastern Europe. That all were magnified and led to major protests. So the regime understands that the groundwork is fertile in Iran for the next round of protests, and they're trying to break it. And Pezeshkian is an attempt to break it again stylistically. And abroad, that's the other 50%, that's the other shoe, to prevent this warming transatlantic consensus. Again, the Europeans are talking about Iranian drones. They're sanctioning, they're expanding their ballistic missile sanctions on the Islamic Republic. These are game-changing things for our European friends. Yes, we would always love them to do more. Yes, we do need snapback as of yesterday, but they're also not at zero. They're also not resting on their laurels. There's been over a dozen rounds of human rights sanctions and more from the Europeans since the Women Life Freedom movement. Our friends in the transatlantic community deserve support, particularly when they're coming under fire from their own parliaments about doing these things. And the regime doesn't want this to continue and is grossly afraid of it continuing if there is a Trump 2.0 that would revert to maximum pressure and bring its friends along with it. So they're setting the seeds right now to shatter that consensus. And that's why all the reporting you're seeing about now is who might be Pezeshkian's foreign minister. There's even a report that's saying it could be the deputy foreign minister of the guy who was under President Rouhani. So Mohammad Javad Zarif was the foreign minister. He was on the campaign staff of Pezeshkian. Zarif's deputy is a guy named Abbas Arakchi. He was in the JCPOA talks. This guy is highly likely about to play musical chairs and enter in with a promotion as foreign minister.
Speaking of the JCPOA and snapback sanctions, so many clauses of the JCPOA have already expired or about to expire, and most Americans are totally oblivious of this. Can you just talk a bit about these sanctions that are about to expire?
Yeah, the JCPOA, it's in some ways it's really funny because the debate here in Washington, where I work and live, might still be tied to the JCPOA. Again, the reporting is telling you about the prospect of a renewed nuclear deal. That's not necessarily what's in the zeitgeist. Yes, it was brought up during the campaign in quotes, season with Pezeshkian in particular, talking about the JCPOA, talking about FATF, talking about these other things that the Rouhani government would have liked to take to the next level. But ultimately, these are things that are not really the same weight or don't have the same talking point value in the Iranian press because they've moved on. Essentially, the JCPOA is an obsession with immense respect that exists in the transatlantic community among our European friends and interlocutors who still believe in the non-proliferation value of the deal, and a flank of the Democratic Party that sees this thing as foreign policy and political dogma. And that's it. Everyone else has moved on. You've had a arms embargo expire in 2020. And I remember the fights so vigorous, so vitriolic in 2020, late summer, early fall 2020, when our friends again across the pond in Europe did not believe in the value of having to defend an international arms embargo because they thought Iranian weapons proliferation, again, short-sighted, was an Israeli problem, was an Arab problem. You fast forward only 2 years, and Iranian drones are targeting European critical infrastructure, killing European citizens, and greasing the wheels and underwriting Putin's war machine. So this is the failure to imagine, but it's also the failure to assess trend lines and objective realities, and is the cost of seeing the world as you wish it to be rather than that which it is. That was 2020. In 2023, a major prohibition on Iran's ballistic missile testing and transfers lapsed. And the Russians, soon after that lapse in October 2023, sent a note out saying, that they would no longer be constrained legally or politically from purchasing any sort of arms, including missiles, from the Islamic Republic, purchasing or selling or transferring in either direction, I have to say. There's been a whole host of nuclear-related clauses as well, but that stuff I'm not going to get into because you've seen the Islamic Republic actively transgress those caps anyway since May of 2019, since the one-year anniversary of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. And we've gotten to a point where even as of November 2021, the Europeans talked about Iran's nuclear violations and advances eroding the counterproliferation benefits of the JCPOA. And essentially the situation that we had just a month or so ago, where the Europeans were to America's right at the IAEA Board of Governors, worried about previously undeclared sites, worried about Iran's gaps in the monitoring of videos when it comes to Iran's centrifuge production, worried about grossly the advanced centrifuges that are coming online, worried about the tunneling at another site, potentially at Natanz. So there are so many concerns here. And we're talking about Pezeshkian, we're talking about the death of Raisi, we're talking a bit about the region. We're not talking about, what is the crown jewel, which is the nuclear program. And that's precisely where the regime wants us.
Behnam, personally, do you believe that Iran has passed the nuclear threshold?
I believe Iran is in terms of the academic definition of a nuclear threshold nation, they're a borderline threshold nation right now. And I'm actually working on a paper. Well, I'm working on quite too many papers at once. That's why I'm slow to produce, but I'm advancing a long column all at once. So you start one, you go to another one, you go to another one, then you go back to the first one. And so I'm working on a paper with actually an Israeli scholar, and she used to be in the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency. But these views are her own. She's a think tanker now. She's totally independent. And we're bouncing around a thesis that Iran has a combination of a political strategy and a technical strategy that when you put it together and you layer on the drones and the missiles and the whatnot and the terrorist apparatus, you have the net result is free nuclear deterrence without any of the costs of weaponization. So free nuclear deterrence becomes a function of a technical strategy of latency, a political strategy of hedging, plus long-range strike capabilities like ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, plus anti-access area denial, anti-ship capabilities like cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, plus the terrorist apparatus. And you put all of these things together, it renders the regime safe enough to continue to export its revolution and to function like the terrorist state like the Islamic Republic is. So why, it's not that the regime would not go all the way, but this helps explain why the regime feels confident enough to do what it's doing. And that confidence is a less fancy way to say the threshold status, where they can weaponize the threat to further develop their nuclear weapon. And they talk about it routinely. You've had a whole string of comments over the past few years that, from former AEOI chief Saleh, it's like building a car. You have all the components, you haven't assembled it all together. It's like a couple of these Iranian IRGC nuclear security chiefs talking about if being compelled to, they would go all the way. You've had parliamentarians talk about this kind of stuff. These comments are happening more and more, and we should expect more of them in the Iranian press as well. because they're trying to serve a deterrent purpose, which is to say, we have amassed all this capability, so you best not push us because we would go from here to here. And that's the real danger because Iran is really straddling that fence, sitting on that threshold. And the problem is actually not that they would go from here to here, because that's not a huge technical leap, minus some of the unknown unknowns that we have about their weaponization program. And there's a really interesting story about a couple of weeks or maybe a month back from Axios that was talking about some computer modeling that may have been restarted in Tehran. So one person's definition of weaponization is not necessarily the other's. So this is a huge intelligence problem, a glaring red flag for us to have to focus on. But the fact that the regime was able to go from 0 to 60%, or even enriched, if you remember last February, to 83, 84% purity, and got away with it.
Okay, the late Qasem Soleimani had spoken about creating a ring of fire around the state of Israel. So I think there are many people in the United States who believe that this is just Israel's problem. What would it take to wake up the West and the United States in particular to realize that this is not just Israel's problem? This is a problem for the entire West.
Well, there's a couple of things here. One is that you may remember that the first Secretary General of NATO, his name escapes me, but they asked him, why was NATO created? And I'm going to paraphrase what he said. He said it was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And this proxy and partner and terror group and militia strategy that the Quds Force and Qasem Soleimani in particular has helped the Islamic Republic architect over the past 4 decades, that aids in deniability, that allows them to fight low intensity and asymmetric wars as they choose across a series of whole failed states across the region that target not just Israelis and Americans, but also coalition members in places like Iraq and Afghanistan in the past. That harasses their neighbors and that erodes at what's left of that strong straight structure in the Middle East. That's why the GCC is in their targets. That's why Jordan now is in their targets. So this is not at all just an Israeli problem. And the Iranian or the Islamic Republic version of that is, if NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in, it was to keep the Americans out, the Arabs down, and the militias in, such that they could slowly, through a death by 1,000 cuts, take that to the next level, which was to act on death to Israel, act on death to America. And again, you don't have to take it from me. Look at who the militias in places like Iraq and Syria were firing at, and what they were firing at, shortly after the October 7 terrorist attack. They were firing at U.S. positions in Iraq and Syria and Jordan, such that the response ratio that we have today from October to present is about 170 or 180 different strikes on our positions in Iraq and Syria and Jordan. And we have returned fire to that indirect fire that we have received about 17 to 20 times. So we are in their targets.
Very scary, very frightening. And let me see if one of my wonderful staffers, Joseph Epstein, Joseph, do you have any further questions?
Sure. And thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Behnam, for being with us today. So earlier you spoke about how Pezeshkian probably won't change much. But what I want to ask is, how much power does he actually have to make changes? And I guess one way to examine this would be his predecessor, Ebrahim Raisi, was considered very conservative. So what was he able to change while he was president?
So, one thing that took off, and I'm just zooming in on one thing. One thing that took off considerably under the Raisi government was the Iranian space program, particularly the IRGC space program, but also the funding in general that was grown under President Raisi, and the strides made, technical and competency-based strides, for both liquid and solid propellant space launch vehicles in the Islamic Republic. That happened under President Raisi. That doesn't mean Raisi was working the phones to get this thing day and night, but he had the people in place and the political will in place, and more importantly, the green light from institutions that mattered above him to make some of this stuff happen. So personnel is policy. And in the minor stylistic ways that Pezeshkian might be able to impact things is the personnel. And that's why I mentioned someone like Abbas Araghchi being back at the helm, because if you have such an individual, that's a sign that he again wants to tempt the West with some kind of nuclear diplomacy. And that might be an indication of, well, he has a green light to play this game again with the West from the office of the supreme leader. So these are minor ways, but these are stylistically important ways. And even if all you have is the bully pulpit, tone matters. You compare the way Iran's reformists used to critique the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Remember when the series of large sanctions-based UN Security Council resolutions from 2006 to 2010 were being passed against the Islamic Republic, Ahmadinejad mocked them, and he essentially called the docket of the UN Security Council that was spitting out all these resolutions so quickly. He basically mocked it and you know, in not so many words, called it a body part that kept spitting out other things. And for this kind of intellectual non-understanding of the power of the UNSC, of the power of those resolutions, Iran's reformists mocked Ahmadinejad. So sometimes the adversary will bring a technical competency, and sometimes they'll highlight gross technical non-competency. And again, that is a function of personnel as policy.
Thank you. So I had one more question. Particularly, I know you touched on the issue of Pezeshkian being from minority communities, and you also spoke about how the regime fears more than anything its own people. I've heard some people say that you know, having Pezeshkian run as a candidate was one way to sort of assuage these minority communities, which Tehran fears may try to, well, that they may have some separatist intentions. And so they're trying to get rid of those. What would you say to that? Do you think that's accurate?
Not entirely, because if separatism is on the table, that's things that the regime, even when it's perceived and it's not a reality, even when it's perceived, that's stuff that the regime has used, you know, brute military force on. That's why they do military drills in a lot of these provinces anyway. And that's why if you follow the Iranian press, you see that, you know, there's everything from real stories about busting drug smuggling rings to made-up stories about busting foreign intelligence rings. There's all of these things that make these provinces and the people in these provinces basically have to live under the propaganda and the material fist of the Islamic Republic. But I would say the vast majority of these individuals who live on the geographic and social and political periphery of Iran are actually not secessionists and separatists. These are things the regime likes to say to paint them in that securitized brush to justify that massive crackdown. And so the Pezeshkian-based approach of someone who can speak both Azeri and Kurdish and patrilineally and matrilineally has, you know, both groups in, for lack of a better word, in his gene pool, is that he might be able to instrumentally try to assuage some of those concerns stylistically without ever really granting them just that kind of equality before the law and respect from the central government in Tehran that they deserve.
The regime has executed more people in 2023 than any other nation. I'm not sure I have the exact number, but it was an astronomical number. How much of the charges do you think were real? I mean, they executed people on charges of using drugs, homosexuality, of course, and dissent. How much do you think these are actually
And
based
political.
around and political?
And you know, underlining all of them are political charges. You know, you have charges like being a mohareb, mohareb ba Khuda, which means warring with God, or a religious one, mufsid fil arz, which is someone who spreads corruption on the earth. You know, they can broadly socially construe these definitions, but underlining, I think, a lot of them is this ability to use I call it the injustice system, not the justice system, the injustice system of the Islamic Republic to adjudicate their political fights with society. And then the other huge caveat, as you mentioned, is the first one, the drug one. The Islamic Republic does indeed execute even minors on drug-related offenses. And when you look at major peaks in Iranian executions in the past 2 decades, there's always a huge chunk of them that are tied to drugs. So both real and alleged drug violations.
Awful, awful. So what we're looking at is an incredibly brutal regime. I don't think, just based on your vast knowledge, Behnam, that Mr. Pezeshkian is going to really change the regime's behavior, certainly not in terms of its nuclear program, certainly not in regard to its vast terror proxies and its standing in the international community. And I really doubt that he will change the regime in its attitude towards dissent, towards a freedom of gathering, freedom of the press, and freedom of women to wear their hair without being covered by the hijab. So despite what the international community is buzzing about right now in the press, I don't think that the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world is going to really, and its internal domestic community is really going to change that much.
If I can just add a quick footnote there, with just the things that should be in the press more are right now, the fact that this guy, Pezeshkian, has gotten on the phones with the likes of Hassan Nasrallah, the Lebanese Hezbollah leader, talking about ideological alignment, towards what end. And then, of course, with America's great power competitor, Putin of Russia. This is someone who, when he campaigned, talked or tried to gain popularity by quipping at some of the other hardliners at the stage, but when he was in parliament, wore even the IRGC uniform to parliament, supported the downing of American drones shot down by the IRGC, supported the regime's militarist and confrontational policy towards then the Trump administration, supported the bill, I believe was called the Noor Plan, that had this massive nuclear escalation, blessed it even. So he's certainly got all of this track record, which goes to tell you one thing. This individual is here for change. He's here to change us, not to change Iran or the regime.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Behnam, for your brilliance. Please, if you like what you hear, go to fdd.org, support them, and also please support us at amedonline.org. We all depend on you, our listeners, to keep us alive and to keep our many, many activities in progress as all of this unfolds. Thank you so, so much, Behnam. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.